My mother refused to attend my wedding, and I felt that before I even saw the empty seat. The church was full that morning. Soft music floated through the air, and sunlight poured through the tall stained glass windows, painting warm colors across the stone floor. White flowers lined the aisle. Friends, relatives, and neighbors filled the wooden pews, dressed in their best clothes, smiling, whispering, turning to look as I stepped inside in my wedding dress. It should have felt beautiful. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, my eyes went straight to the front row and stopped at the one chair that no one had touched. It was the seat saved for my mother. Everyone noticed it. I could feel it. Some people tried not to stare, but their eyes kept drifting back to it. Others didn't even bother pretending. I heard the whispers as I walked slowly down the aisle, holding my bouquet so tightly my fingers hurt. Her mother really didn't come. She meant it. I kept my face calm, but inside, I felt hollow. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The day a daughter looks for her mother and finds comfort in one smile. But my mother was not there. And the worst part was that everyone knew exactly why. She believed Daniel was marrying me for my father's money. 3 nights earlier, my mother and I stood in the living room of the house I grew up in, and I knew before she even spoke that nothing good was about to come from that conversation. The room smelled faintly of furniture polish and the lily someone had brought after my bridal shower. My wedding shoes were still in their box near the staircase. Guest lists, ribbon samples, and place cards covered the coffee table. Everywhere I looked, there were signs that my wedding was close. But my mother stood in the middle of it all like she wanted to tear the whole thing apart. "You still have time to stop this," she said. Her voice was calm, but it was the cold kind of calm that hurts more than shouting. I stared at her. "Stop what?" She folded her arms and looked at me with disappointment, almost like I had become a stranger in my own home. "Don't do that, Amara. Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about. That man is not marrying you because he loves you." My chest tightened. I had heard her doubts before, but something in her face that night told me she had gone far beyond doubt. She had decided. "You don't know Daniel the way I do," I said. She gave a short laugh with no warmth in it. "Oh, I know enough. Your father spent his whole life building this family's name. The business, the land, the investments. Everything we have came from his hard work." Then she looked me straight in the eye and said, "And that man only wants what your father left behind." For a second, I could not even answer. Not because I believed her, but because I could not believe she would say it so plainly. Daniel had never asked me for money. He had never pushed himself into family matters. He had never behaved like someone chasing wealth. If anything, he avoided those conversations more than anyone I knew. But my mother would not listen. "If you marry him," she said, "don't expect me to stand there and pretend I support it." I remember the silence after that more than I remember her words. It was heavy, final. Like a door had closed between us. I wanted to argue. I wanted to defend him. I wanted to ask how grief had turned her heart so hard. Instead, I just looked at her and understood something terrible. My mother had already chosen what to believe and nothing I said was going to change it. By the time I reached the altar, I felt as if every eye in the church was on me. Daniel turned as I came closer, and for 1 second, everything else faded. The whispers, the empty chair, the weight in my chest, all of it. He looked at me the way he always did, steady and calm, like he was trying to hold the world still long enough for me to breathe. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. I nodded, because I did not trust my voice. He studied my face for a moment, and I knew he understood more than I wanted him to. That was one thing about Daniel. He noticed small things, the way my hands shook. The way I pressed my lips together when I was trying not to cry. The way I looked at that empty seat and then quickly away from it. But he did not push. He did not ask another question. He just stayed there beside me, quiet and solid. That was also what confused people about him. My mother had accused him. Some relatives had repeated her words. Others had stayed silent, which sometimes felt worse. Yet Daniel never argued back. He never tried to win people over with grand speeches. He never defended himself the way most men would. Sometimes I wondered why. Why stay quiet when people were judging you? Why let them believe the worst? As the pastor opened his book and began speaking, I glanced toward the small table near the altar. A framed photograph of my father stood there beside a vase of white roses. My throat tightened at once. Because seeing his face brought back something he once told me after meeting Daniel for the first time. At the time, I had not understood what he meant. Now, standing there on my wedding day with my mother missing and the church full of whispers, I began to wonder if my father had seen something in Daniel long before the rest of us did. Seeing my father's photograph beside the altar brought back a memory so clear that for a moment I almost forgot I was standing in my wedding dress. It happened 3 years earlier, on the evening Daniel first came to our house for dinner. My father had always been a careful observer. He liked to listen more than he spoke. That night he watched Daniel quietly across the table while my mother asked polite but distant questions. Daniel answered respectfully. He didn't try to impress anyone. He didn't talk about money, success, or big plans the way some men do when they meet a woman's parents. Instead, he spoke simply about his work, his childhood, and the small town where he grew up. After dinner, Daniel thanked my parents and left. I remember standing by the front window, watching his car disappear down the street. My father joined me there. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he folded his arms and looked out into the dark road. "That young man carries a story," he said quietly. I turned to him. "What kind of story?" He shook his head slowly. "The kind people don't talk about easily." I laughed a little at the time because I thought he was being dramatic. But now, standing in the church years later, I wondered if my father had seen something in Daniel that none of us understood yet. Over the months after that dinner, something unusual began to happen. Daniel started visiting my father more often. At first I thought it was just friendly conversation. My father enjoyed meeting new people, especially those who worked hard and had strong opinions about life. Daniel fit that description perfectly. But their talks slowly became longer. Sometimes Daniel would arrive in the afternoon, and the two of them would sit on the back porch for hours, talking while the sun moved across the hills behind our house. Other times they would disappear into my father's study and close the door. Whenever I asked what they talked about, my father would smile and wave his hand like it was nothing important. "Just life," he would say. Daniel gave the same answer. Still, there was something serious about the way they spoke to each other. It wasn't the casual tone people use when discussing sports or the weather. Their voices were thoughtful, quiet, sometimes intense. My mother noticed it too. One evening after Daniel left, she stood by the kitchen counter and said, "Your father seems very interested in that young man." Her voice sounded careful, almost suspicious. At the time, I shrugged it off. I thought they had simply become friends. Looking back now, I realized something else had been growing between them. Something none of us truly understood. The moment that confused me the most happened on a stormy night late that same year. Rain pounded against the windows, and thunder rolled across the sky like distant drums. The power flickered twice before the lights steadied again. I had just come downstairs to make tea when I noticed the door to my father's study was slightly open. Inside, the lamp on his desk cast a warm circle of light across the room. Daniel was there with him. They were speaking quietly, but the storm had made the house so silent that their voices carried through the hallway. I wasn't trying to listen. I was simply walking past. Then I heard my father say something that made me stop. "If anything ever happens to me," he said slowly, "I want you to promise me something." There was a pause. A long one. Then Daniel answered. "You have my word." My father spoke again, softer this time. "Take care of her." Before I could hear anything else, the study door closed. I stood there in the hallway for a moment, holding the mug in my hands, feeling strangely unsettled. At the time, I told myself my father was just being protective. But now, remembering that night on the morning of my wedding, I couldn't stop wondering what promise Daniel had truly made. The morning after the storm felt strangely normal. Sunlight filled the kitchen, birds sang outside the windows, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the house. My father sat at the breakfast table reading the newspaper like he did every morning. Daniel arrived shortly after. If the conversation from the night before had been serious, neither of them showed it. My father greeted him with his usual calm smile, and Daniel nodded politely as he stepped inside. They spoke about simple things at first. Work. The weather. A charity event happening downtown. But something felt different. My father seemed relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. Daniel looked the same as always, quiet, thoughtful, steady. At one point my father looked at me and said, "Daniel is staying for lunch today." The way he said it made it sound less like a request and more like a decision that had already been made. I noticed my mother watching them carefully from across the room. Her eyes moved from my father to Daniel and back again. She didn't say anything. But I could see a question forming in her mind. And from that day forward, something in our house began to shift. After that stormy night, my father and Daniel seemed even closer than before. Their meetings became more regular. Sometimes Daniel arrived early in the morning before work. Other times he came in the evening and stayed long after dinner. They still spoke privately most of the time. Whenever they sat on the back porch together, their voices dropped low enough that I could not hear the details. But the tone was always serious. It wasn't the relaxed conversation of two friends. It sounded more like planning. My mother began noticing it more and more. One afternoon she stood by the window watching Daniel walk toward the gate after another visit. "There's something strange about that young man," she said quietly. I looked up from the book I was reading. "What do you mean?" She hesitated before answering. "I can't explain it. Your father trusts him too quickly." I shook my head. "He just likes him." But my mother didn't look convinced. She continued staring through the glass as Daniel disappeared down the road. At the time, I thought she was simply being protective. Looking back now, I realized that was the first moment my mother truly began to doubt him. And those doubts only grew stronger after my father died. My father passed away 2 years before my wedding. The day it happened felt unreal, like the world had suddenly slowed down. People filled our house for days afterward. Relatives, neighbors, business partners, everyone came to offer condolences. Flowers covered every table. The quiet sound of voices and footsteps moved constantly through the halls. Daniel came too. He didn't say much, but he stayed longer than most people. He helped carry chairs when guests arrived. He brought food when the kitchen grew empty. When my mother became overwhelmed by visitors, he quietly guided people outside so she could rest. I noticed all of it. But my mother noticed something else. After the funeral, when the house finally became quiet again, she sat across from me in the living room and said the words that changed everything. "That young man is around too much." I frowned. "He's just helping." She leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "No, Amara. He's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Her answer came without hesitation. "For the inheritance your father left behind." Those words hung in the air between us. And for the first time, I realized my mother truly believed Daniel had his own reasons for staying close to our family. My mother's words that evening stayed with me long after the conversation ended. I wanted to believe she was only speaking from grief. Losing my father had changed her in ways none of us expected. The house felt emptier without his calm voice, and sometimes the silence made everyone uneasy. Still, the next time Daniel visited, I noticed my mother watching him more closely than before. It happened during dinner a few days later. We were sitting around the table when my mother suddenly set her fork down and looked straight at him. "You spend a lot of time here," she said. The room became quiet. Daniel met her gaze calmly. "Your husband was someone I respected very much. I like being here." "That's not what I meant," she replied. I felt my stomach tighten. She leaned back in her chair and continued, "Some people stay close to a family because they care. Others stay because they expect something in return." The meaning was clear. I opened my mouth to protest, but Daniel spoke first. His voice remained calm. "I have never wanted anything that doesn't belong to me." That was all he said. But strangely, his quiet answer only seemed to make my mother more certain of her suspicions. Months passed after that dinner, and life slowly settled into a new routine. Daniel and I spent more time together, taking long walks through the park near the river or sitting by the lake where we had first met years earlier. Those moments felt peaceful, far away from the tension that sometimes filled my mother's house. One evening near sunset, Daniel asked me to walk with him along the wooden dock by the lake. The water was calm and reflected the orange light of the sky. A cool breeze moved across the surface, carrying the quiet sound of birds returning to the trees. We stopped near the end of the dock. Daniel looked nervous in a way I had never seen before. For a moment he said nothing. Then he reached into his pocket and took out a small box. My heart immediately began to race. "Amara," he said softly, "I know life has not been easy since your father passed away. But being with you has always felt right to me." He opened the box, revealing a simple ring. "Will you marry me?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." At that moment, nothing else seemed to matter. But when my mother heard the news the next day, her reaction was nothing like I expected. The moment I told my mother about the engagement, I knew things were about to change. She stood in the kitchen holding a dish towel, staring at me as if she had misunderstood what I said. "You said yes?" she asked slowly. "Yes," I answered. "Daniel asked me last night." For a few seconds she said nothing. Then she set the towel down on the counter and shook her head. "I hoped you would be wiser than this." The words stung more than I expected. Why can't you just be happy for me? I asked. Because I can see what you refuse to see, she replied. Her voice grew harder with each sentence. That man came into our lives right when your father died. He stayed close. He listened to everything. And now suddenly he wants to marry the only daughter of a man who left behind a fortune. That's not fair, I said quietly. It's the truth, she insisted. I felt my patience finally begin to crack. You don't know him, I said firmly. She stepped closer, her eyes cold. If you marry him, Amara, don't expect me to stand there pretending I approve. At that moment, I didn't realize she meant every single word. 3 days before the wedding, the argument between my mother and me finally reached its breaking point. The house was quiet that afternoon. Wedding invitations were already sent, decorations were being prepared at the church, and relatives had begun arriving in town. Everything should have felt exciting. Instead, the air in the living room felt heavy. My mother stood near the window while I sat on the couch reviewing the seating list. When she saw Daniel's name written beside mine at the head table, something in her expression hardened. So it's really happening, she said. Yes, I answered calmly. The wedding is in 3 days. She turned to face me fully. You're making the worst mistake of your life. I set the paper down slowly. We've already talked about this. And you refuse to listen, she replied sharply. That man is manipulating you. He waited until your father was gone. Now he thinks he can step in and take everything. I stood up, anger finally rising in my chest. That's not true, I said. But my mother shook her head. You're blind, Amara. Completely blind. Then she picked up her purse, walked toward the door, and said something I never expected to hear. I will not attend that wedding. Now, standing in the church with that empty chair in the front row, I felt the full weight of her words. The ceremony had already begun. The pastor spoke gently about love, commitment, and the meaning of marriage. His calm voice filled the quiet church while guests listened politely. Daniel stood beside me, his posture steady, his hands relaxed. I tried to focus on the ceremony, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the front row. The empty seat seemed impossible to ignore. Every time I glanced toward it, I felt a mixture of sadness and disappointment that I could not easily explain. My mother had missed birthdays before. She had missed family dinners when work kept her busy. But missing her daughter's wedding felt different. It felt final. The pastor eventually closed the small book he had been reading from. For this couple, he said warmly, today marks the beginning of a new life together. Then he paused. I noticed him reach into the inside pocket of his jacket and pull out a folded envelope. His expression changed slightly as he looked toward me. There is one more thing I must do before we continue. The entire room grew quiet. Because none of us expected what he said next. The pastor held the envelope carefully in both hands. This letter was given to me 2 years ago, he explained slowly. My heart skipped. 2 years ago was the year my father passed away. He asked me to keep it safe, the pastor continued, and to read it aloud on a very specific day. I felt Daniel glance at me briefly, but I couldn't look away from the envelope. Richard Bennett told me this letter should be read on the day of his daughter's wedding. A murmur moved through the church. I heard chairs shift quietly and people whisper to one another. No one had ever mentioned a letter before. Not my relatives. Not the lawyer who handled my father's estate. No one. The pastor unfolded the paper slowly. For many years, he began reading, my daughter believed that our family business was strong and successful. I felt my chest tighten. But the truth, the letter continued, is that there was a time when I almost lost everything. I blinked in confusion. I had never heard that story before. My father had always seemed strong. Successful. In control. Yet the letter suggested something very different. And suddenly I realized the next part of his story was going to change everything we thought we knew. The pastor continued reading while the entire church listened in complete silence. In the early years of my business, my father wrote, there came a moment when everything nearly collapsed. Investors pulled out. Projects failed. The bank was preparing to take back the buildings I had worked my whole life to build. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I had never heard any of this before. To me, my father had always been strong and successful. The business was stable. The house was secure. My childhood felt safe. But according to the letter, there had been a time when everything was close to disappearing. I remember sitting in my office one evening, the letter continued, looking at numbers that made no sense and realizing I might lose everything my family depended on. The pastor paused for a moment before continuing. That was when a young man walked into my office with an idea that changed everything. I saw several people in the church lean forward slightly. Even the quiet sound of breathing seemed louder now. He was not wealthy. He had no influence. But he had something more important. The pastor looked down at the next line. He had integrity. And somehow, in that moment, I felt the story slowly beginning to move toward something much bigger than any of us expected. The pastor continued reading while the room remained perfectly still. The young man offered to help rebuild the company, my father wrote. Not for money. Not for recognition. But simply because he believed the business could survive. I tried to picture my father during that difficult time alone in his office, facing the possibility of losing everything. And then this mysterious young man appearing with a solution. For months we worked late into the night, the letter explained. We reviewed contracts, restructured projects, and rebuilt trust with partners who had almost given up on us. My father's words painted a picture I had never seen before. A quiet struggle. A hidden battle that happened long before I understood how fragile success could be. Whenever I offered him payment, my father continued, he refused. The pastor's voice grew softer as he read the next line. He said helping someone stand back up was reward enough. I felt a strange warmth rise in my chest. Whoever this person was, my father clearly respected him deeply. But the biggest question remained. Who is this young man? And why had my father kept his identity secret for so many years? The pastor lowered the letter slightly and looked up from the page. For a moment he didn't speak. His eyes slowly moved across the church as if he understood the tension growing in the room. Guests were shifting in their seats now, whispering quietly to one another. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Who was the man my father had trusted so much? The pastor finally continued reading. For years, my father wrote, this young man stood beside me while the business slowly recovered. Together we rebuilt everything that had once seemed lost. I felt the weight of those words settle over the room. But there was one condition he insisted on, the letter said. The pastor paused again. He asked that his role remain private. A few people in the church glanced around, trying to guess who the man might have been. My own thoughts raced. Could it have been one of my father's partners? A business advisor? Someone we knew but had never suspected? The pastor's voice grew very quiet as he read the next sentence. For years, no one knew about the young man who helped save our family's future. Then he stopped reading. And slowly lifted his eyes toward the altar. Toward Daniel. For a moment the pastor did not read another word. The entire church seemed to hold its breath. I felt the tension around me, like the air had suddenly grown heavier. Some guests leaned forward in their seats. Others glanced at each other, clearly wondering what the letter would reveal next. Then the pastor lifted the paper again. The young man who helped me rebuild everything, my father wrote, is someone my daughter already knows. A ripple of quiet whispers spread across the room. My heart began beating faster. I looked at the photograph of my father beside the altar, trying to understand what he meant. Someone I already knew? My mind quickly moved through the names of my father's old colleagues and business partners. But none of them seemed to fit the story. The pastor continued reading. For years he asked me to keep his role secret, the letter said. He believed the work mattered more than recognition. The pastor paused again. I felt Daniel standing beside me, still calm, still silent. Then the pastor read the next sentence slowly. That young man is standing beside my daughter today. A sudden gasp spread through the church. And every single face turned toward Daniel. For a few seconds no one moved. The silence in the church felt almost unreal. I turned slowly toward Daniel, my thoughts racing so fast I could barely understand what was happening. Guests were staring at him now, some with surprise, others with disbelief. But Daniel's expression had not changed. He stood exactly the same way he had a moment earlier, calm and steady, as if the letter had revealed something he had known all along. The pastor continued reading. Daniel never asked for payment, my father wrote. Even when the company recovered and profits returned, he refused every offer I made. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd. Eventually I realized something important, the letter said. I could never repay his loyalty with money. The pastor turned the page. So I made a different decision. My chest tightened. Several years ago, my father continued, I quietly transferred part of my investments and properties into Daniel's care. I heard a few shocked whispers behind me. But the letter was not finished. I did this not as a reward, my father wrote. I did it because I trusted him more than anyone else. The pastor read the final lines of the letter slowly, allowing every word to settle in the quiet church. I trusted Daniel not because he loved our wealth, my father wrote. I trusted him because he stood beside me when there was no wealth left. Those words seemed to echo through the room. For years my mother had believed Daniel was waiting for an inheritance. For years some relatives had quietly wondered the same thing. But now the truth stood in front of all of us. Daniel had been there long before anyone else knew the business was in trouble. He had helped rebuild everything my father created. And he had done it without asking for credit, payment, or recognition. The pastor folded the letter carefully. That is the message Richard Bennett asked me to share on his daughter's wedding day. The room remained silent. I looked at Daniel again, trying to see him through this new understanding. He noticed my expression and gave a small, gentle smile. And in that moment I realized something that changed everything. My father had trusted Daniel long before I ever understood why. For several long seconds after the pastor finished reading, no one spoke. The entire church felt different now. Just minutes earlier, people had been whispering about my mother's absence and quietly wondering whether her accusations might have been true. I had felt those whispers like small stones pressing against my chest. But now the same people were looking at Daniel with a completely different expression. Some looked surprised. Others looked embarrassed. A few lowered their eyes as if realizing how quickly they had judged someone they barely understood. My uncle cleared his throat softly. My aunt wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. Even the guests who had been whispering earlier now sat in respectful silence. I turned slowly toward Daniel again. He looked exactly the same as before the letter was read. Calm. Patient. Almost uncomfortable with the attention suddenly directed at him. You knew about this? I asked quietly. He nodded once. Your father asked me to keep it private. Why didn't you tell me? Daniel's answer came gently. Because he asked me not to. I looked back toward my father's photograph beside the altar. For the first time that day, the empty seat in the front row no longer felt like the center of the room. As the quiet in the church slowly settled, something else began to change inside me. For most of the morning I had been focused on my mother's absence. Every glance at the empty chair reminded me of the argument we had shared and the painful words she had spoken about Daniel. But now I understood something I had never fully realized before. My father had already made his choice long ago. He had watched Daniel carefully. He had trusted him when the future of our family was uncertain. And when the business finally recovered, he had chosen to place part of that future in Daniel's hands. Not because Daniel asked, but because Daniel had already proven himself when no one else was watching. I felt tears gather in my eyes as that realization settled over me. All this time I thought my father never had the chance to give his blessing for this marriage. But the truth was far more powerful. He had given that blessing years earlier. He had simply chosen a quiet way to show it. I turned back toward Daniel and saw the same calm strength in his eyes that my father must have seen long before I did. In that moment, I felt my father closer than I had all day. The pastor smiled warmly as he looked at both of us. I believe Richard Bennett has already shared his thoughts about this marriage, he said gently. Now it is time for the couple to share their vows. A soft wave of laughter moved through the guests, easing the tension that had filled the room earlier. I turned fully toward Daniel. For the first time that morning, I felt completely steady. You kept your promise, I whispered. Daniel's smile was quiet but sincere. I promised your father I would always protect what mattered most to him, he said softly. And what was that? I asked. His answer came without hesitation. You. The simplicity of that word filled my chest with warmth. Around us, our friends and relatives watched with new understanding. The accusations, the doubts, the whispers that had followed Daniel for months suddenly seemed small and distant. The pastor continued the ceremony, guiding us through the vows we had written together. When we finished speaking them, the church felt brighter than it had all morning. Not because anything magical had happened, but because the truth had finally been heard. When the ceremony ended and the guests began congratulating us, I found myself glancing one last time toward the empty chair in the front row. For a moment I felt the familiar sadness return. I wished my mother had been there to hear the letter. I wished she had seen the truth about Daniel with her own eyes. But at the same time, something inside me felt peaceful. My father had always believed that people reveal their character not during easy moments, but during difficult ones. Daniel had proven his character years earlier when the business was failing and no one else knew the struggle my father faced. He had stood beside my father when the future looked uncertain. And today, that quiet loyalty had finally come into the light. I took Daniel's hand as we stepped outside the church together. Sunlight warmed the stone steps, and our friends and family gathered around us with smiles and laughter. For the first time all day, the weight in my chest lifted completely. My father may not have been there in person, but through the words he left behind, he had given us something even greater than approval. He had given us the truth about the man I had chosen to marry. And sometimes, the quietest acts of loyalty become the strongest legacy a person can leave behind.